From just 7 birds remaining in the wild in 1981, the population has now grown into thousands, transforming the species into a symbol of successful wildlife protection.
That's the entire number of crested ibis left alive on planet Earth in the spring of 1981. Not 7 flocks, not 7 colonies, just 7 birds, hiding in one valley nobody had ever thought to check. Japan had already given up, capturing its own last 5 wild birds that same year in a desperate final attempt to save them. China made a different choice. What followed over the next 4 decades is one of the most unlikely comebacks in conservation history. A species pulled back from almost nothing to thousands, across 3 countries. Let's break down exactly how 7 birds turned into a movement. The 7 birds that saved a species. The crested ibis is not a subtle-looking bird. Its plumage runs white through most of the year, faintly tinged pink at the wingtips and tail. A bare patch of red skin covers its face, and a loose crest of feathers trails backward from the crown of its head like a windswept ornament. Its most distinctive feature might be its bill, long, black, and curved downward, built for a single purpose that has nothing to do with speed or spectacle. Western science first documented the species in 1835 from a specimen collected in Japan and gave it the scientific name Nipponia, Nippon, Japan's bird, twice over, in both its genus and its species name. The naming would turn out to be an irony nobody could have predicted, because by the end of the 20th century, the bird carrying Japan's name in duplicate would owe its continued existence entirely to China. At the start of the 20th century, the crested ibis was one of the more familiar water birds across a wide stretch of East Asia, present in China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and the far eastern reaches of Russia.
The crested ibis is an endangered species. They used to be widely distributed across East Asia and Russia's Siberia.
It nested in tall trees near wetlands and flooded rice paddies, forming loose colonies that shifted between traditional nesting grounds year after year, returning each breeding season to territory their ancestors had used for generations before them. Farmers in these regions had coexisted with the birds for so long that their presence barely registered as remarkable. A familiar shape gliding low over the paddies at dusk, easy to overlook precisely because it had never once been rare. Then, within a few short decades, nearly all of that range simply emptied out. Deforestation removed the tall trees the species needed for nesting. Agricultural modernization drained and converted the wetlands the birds depended on for food. And pesticides, introduced widely across East Asian farmland in the mid-20th century, wiped out the frogs, small fish, and invertebrates that made up the ibis's entire diet. A bird that hunts exclusively in shallow, living water cannot survive in fields treated with modern chemical agriculture. And across country after country, that is exactly the kind of field it was left with. Korea lost the species by the 1930s. Japan lost the overwhelming majority of its population by the 1950s. By the 1960s, Chinese zoologists, searching the countryside for any remaining trace of the bird, were coming back with nothing at all. Liu Yinzeng, a researcher with the Institute of Zoology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, led one of those searches. Beginning in 1978, his team spent 3 years crossing 9 provinces, trekking through mountain ranges, wetlands, and farmland, covering more than 50,000 kilometers by whatever means the terrain allowed. Every single survey came back the same way: empty. By 1981, Liu had already drafted the paper that would formally declare the crested ibis extinct within China's borders, a conclusion built on 3 years of evidence and a near-total absence of hope. What does it take to keep looking after that much confirmation that there's nothing left to find? Before submitting the final report, Liu decided to check one more location: Yangxian County, in Shaanxi Province, at the southern foot of the Qinling Mountains, a place too remote and too poor
Until 7 wild birds appeared in Yangxian County, northwest China's Shaanxi Province, in 1981.
to have drawn the kind of agricultural development that had erased the species everywhere else. On the 23rd of May, and again on the 30th, Lu's team found them. 2 adult pairs and 3 fledglings, perched together in a pine tree on a hillside no survey team had ever reached before. 7 birds, the last crested ibises anywhere on the planet, having survived not because of any protection or plan, but because the valley they called home was too remote for surveyors, too poor for pesticides, and too inconvenient for loggers. The villagers nearby had lived alongside these birds for generations, without any of them realizing that the pair nesting above their rice paddies belonged to a species the rest of the world had already written off. The report reached Beijing within days. By the end of June, word had reached a conservation center in Tokyo, where researchers had spent years quietly mourning a species they were certain no longer existed anywhere on Earth. The message that arrived felt like it belonged to a different reality entirely. 7 birds, alive, in a valley nobody had thought to check. What makes the discovery even harder to take for granted is just how narrow the odds behind it really were. Lu's team had already covered 9 provinces and tens of thousands of kilometers without a single success. Yangxian hadn't been flagged as a promising location by any existing data. It simply happened to be next on a long list of places still left to rule out. A slightly different route, a shortened final season, or a decision to submit the extinction paper one valley earlier, and this discovery never happens at all. There would have been no 7 birds to report, no valley left to protect, and no foundation left to build a recovery on. 2 countries, 2 very different choices. This is where the story splits, and where the gap between 2 conservation strategies becomes impossible to ignore. That same year, 1981, Japan made its own move to save what remained of its ibis population. With its wild numbers reduced to almost nothing, Japanese authorities captured the last 5 wild crested ibises.
South Korea has recently seen several ibises newly born in the wild for the first time in over 4 decades.
Living on Sado Island, and placed them into a dedicated breeding center, hoping controlled conditions could accomplish what the wild landscape no longer could. On paper, it looked like the responsible decision: remove the last vulnerable individuals from a degraded habitat and let careful, monitored breeding rebuild the population from a place of safety. It did not work. Not one of those 5 birds ever produced a surviving offspring. Year after year of attempted breeding passed without a single successful chick, as caretakers tried pairing after pairing among birds that were already aging and already few in number. The birds aged in captivity, and one by one, they died, until only a single female remained. Her name was Kin, and she outlived every other bird from that original group of 5 by decades. But she outlived them alone, with no mate left and no bloodline left to continue. She died in 2003, more than 2 decades after her capture, closing out a population that had never once, in over 20 years, managed to produce a surviving chick. In the truest sense, Japan's native population was gone, not slowly fading, but simply ending. China chose the opposite path. When Lu's team found the 7 birds in Yangxian, they left them exactly where they were. There was no second population anywhere to fall back on, no captive insurance policy waiting in reserve if something went wrong. These 7 birds, in this one valley, represented the entire genetic future of the species, and researchers understood that moving them into captivity risked repeating Japan's failure with even less room for error. Instead, the valley itself was placed under protection within weeks of the discovery. Pesticide use in the surrounding rice paddies was banned outright. Local farmers were asked, and eventually paid, to return to the slower, lower-yield farming methods their grandparents had once used, the kind that left shallow, chemical-free water sitting in the paddies through the winter months, rather than draining and treating the fields for maximum output. Why does that particular detail matter so much for a bird? Because the crested ibis cannot hunt in dry fields, and it cannot hunt in deep water either. It wades into shallow mud, inserts that long curved bill, and feels for prey by touch: frogs, small fish, crayfish, earthworms. Take away the shallow, living water, and the bird has nowhere left to feed. no matter how many trees are left standing for it to nest in. Nest trees were identified and quietly guarded. Volunteers monitored the surviving pairs through each breeding season, chasing off predators and supplementing food when conditions turned harsh, all while staying far enough back that the notoriously sensitive birds wouldn't abandon a nest mid-incubation. A real risk, since a single close approach during breeding season could cause a pair to walk away from eggs or chicks entirely. Researchers also began collecting extra eggs from nests that held more than one, hatching them by hand in controlled conditions while the wild parents raised the rest of the clutch, a way of growing the population's numbers without ever disturbing the only breeding pairs left in existence. China ran a captive program of its own too, established at Beijing Zoo that same year. But the crucial difference was that it worked alongside a wild population that was still reproducing on its own, feeding fresh genetics and fresh eggs into the captive effort, rather than relying on a handful of isolated, aging birds with nowhere left to draw from. Two conservation efforts, launched in the same year, aimed at saving the same handful of surviving birds, using the same basic tool of captive breeding. Only one of them had a living wild population behind it to draw on. And that single difference is most of the reason one approach failed completely while the other became a model studied around the world. Building a comeback, one egg at a time, progress, in the earliest years, was close to non-existent. Through 1982, the wild population in Yangxian was still hovering around 7, with breeding attempts underway, but chick survival far from guaranteed. Every storm, every predator, every failed nest carried the weight of the species' entire future. There was no cushion, no second colony elsewhere that could absorb a bad season if this one went wrong. Could a handful of birds confined to one valley really rebuild an entire population from nothing? For the better part of a decade, nobody working on the project could say for certain that the answer was yes. Within weeks of the discovery, a temporary protection station had already been set up in Yaojiago village, staffed by a small team of just 4 young volunteers whose job was to watch the birds every day and make sure nothing happened to them while they foraged. That same year, Yangxian County issued formal regulations banning logging and the use of pesticides and fertilizers across the surrounding area, turning an informal understanding into enforceable local law, one of the earliest examples anywhere of a local government reshaping agricultural policy around the needs of a single, nearly vanished species. There was no guarantee any of this would hold. A single harsh winter could have wiped out a meaningful fraction of a population that still numbered in the single digits. A predator finding one of the handful of active nests could have erased an entire breeding season's worth of progress in a single night. The team monitoring the valley had no way to ensure against any of it. No reserve population elsewhere, no fallback plan if a season went badly. Only close observation, patience, and the hope that the next clutch of eggs would fare better than the last. Then, gradually, the numbers began to move. By the early 1990s, the wild population had climbed past 20 individuals, a modest figure by almost any standard, but a genuinely significant one for a species that had spent the previous decade as a single digit. New nesting sites started appearing outside the original valley, clear evidence that birds were expanding into surrounding terrain on their own initiative, rather than being relocated there by researchers. Through the 1990s, artificial breeding techniques and disease prevention measures improved considerably, and local villagers who had once simply tolerated the protection effort became active participants in it, reporting nests and helping monitor territory researchers couldn't cover alone. By the year 2000, the population within Shaanxi province had crossed 100 individuals.
They are crested ibises, the natural monument number 198 in Korea,
Spread across roughly 18 known nesting sites. 5 years after that, the wild population alone had passed 500. In 2007, China achieved the world's first successful reintroduction of the species into a new wild location, releasing a group of birds into Ningxian County, Shaanxi. The offspring of that release became the world's first entirely reintroduced crested ibis population, separate from the original Yangxian group. None of that expansion happened by accident. and almost none of it happened without the sustained cooperation of people who had every economic incentive to farm differently. Traditional rice farming produces meaningfully lower yields than modern, intensive agriculture. That gap in output is precisely why farmers across the region had been abandoning the old methods in the first place. Convincing an entire county to accept a financial disadvantage, indefinitely, for the sake of a bird that most residents had never personally seen, required something more persuasive than an appeal to conservation values alone. It required an economic case. Rice grown in Yangshan without pesticides, specifically to protect the ibis's food supply in the surrounding paddies, was eventually certified and marketed under the ibis's own name, sold at a premium that more than compensated farmers for their reduced yields, and gave them a genuine, ongoing financial reason to keep farming exactly the way the species needed them to. What began as a conservation subsidy had, over time, quietly turned into a functioning market, one where protecting the bird and earning a better living from the land pointed in the same direction instead of competing against each other. It amounted to a partnership neither side had originally asked for. The birds needed farmers willing to keep working the land the old, slower way, without any certainty the effort would ever pay off. The farmers, once given the right incentive, turned out to be willing to do exactly that, and decades later, that same willingness is a large part of why there's a species left to talk about at all. Sending the species home. By the late 1990s, Japan's population still stood at essentially nothing built from its own bloodline, a single aging female with no captive lineage that had managed to continue past her. In January of 1999, China sent 2 birds to Sado Island, a breeding pair named Yang Yang and Yu Yu, gifted as an act that carried both conservation purpose and diplomatic weight between the two countries. Within months of their arrival, the pair produced their first chick, and more chicks followed the year after that. It was the first genuine sign in nearly 2 decades that Japan's relationship with the species might not be over after all. China followed with further gifts of birds in the years after, and the arrangement grew into something closer to an ongoing partnership than a single act of goodwill. An agreement eventually took shape requiring Japan to send a portion of each generation's offspring back to China, a kind of return on the original investment that has continued for decades since. Slowly, that combined effort built a captive population in Japan large enough to attempt something the country had not managed to do in decades. Not just keeping the species alive inside an enclosure, but putting it back into the wild. That effort took the better part of a decade to prepare properly. Sado Island's landscape had changed considerably since the species last thrived there. The shallow, fish-filled rice paddies the ibis depended on for food had, in many areas, been replaced by more modern and far less hospitable fields, mirroring the exact transformation that had already pushed the bird toward extinction once before. Reversing that meant negotiating individually with hundreds of farmers, establishing new subsidy programs, and building a certification system for Sado-grown rice, effectively rebuilding, piece by piece, the same kind of agricultural landscape that had already proven successful back in Shaanxi. Starting in 2007, the birds selected for release were moved into a large adaptation enclosure on the island, a space designed to let them practice foraging and flying in conditions as close to the wild as possible while still under observation. A deliberate final step meant to close the gap between a life spent entirely in captivity and one spent finding food, avoiding danger, and raising young without any human support at all. On the 25th of September 2008, 10 captive-bred crested ibises were released into the wild on Sado Island. It marked the species' first return to the Japanese wild since the last remaining birds had been taken into captivity 27 years earlier. The early results were far from smooth. Some released birds wandered away from the carefully prepared habitat into areas where restoration work hadn't yet caught up, and not every bird survived its first winter fending for itself. Researchers responded by adjusting the timing of future releases, selecting individuals that showed stronger wild foraging instincts, and refining the preparation process each bird went through before being set free. The real turning point arrived in April of 2012, when 3 crested ibis chicks hatched in the wild on Sado Island. Not hand-raised, not incubated under supervision, but hatched and reared entirely by parents who had themselves been born in captivity. It was the first time in 36 years that a crested ibis chick had hatched in Japan's wild. For the researchers, farmers, and local residents who had spent decades working toward exactly this outcome, it was the point where the entire project stopped feeling like a hopeful experiment and started feeling like a fact. Some of the people who had campaigned for that moment had grown up hearing about the toki only as a story their grandparents told. A bird that used to fill the skies over Sado before it simply didn't anymore. A legacy across 3 countries. The recovery did not stop at Japan's borders. South Korea had lost its own wild crested ibis population by the late 1970s.
Crested ibises, once one of Korea's natural monuments, disappeared from the peninsula 37 years ago. The population of crested ibises in Korea has grown to 171. The birds will be released into the wild next year.
And for decades afterward, the bird existed there only as a memory. That changed when China gifted a breeding pair to a South Korean restoration center. The foundation of a captive program built entirely on individuals descended from the same 7 birds found in Yangxian decades earlier. Wild releases in Korea followed years later, and eventually the country recorded its first confirmed wild breeding pair, which built its first wild nest at the edge of a forest in the country's southeast. A small, quiet echo of the moment that had unfolded in China nearly 4 decades earlier. Every single crested ibis alive today, whether in a Chinese nature reserve, on a Japanese hillside, or inside a Korean breeding center, shares the same 7 ancestors and the same one valley. The scale of what that lineage has produced is difficult to take in all at once. By the most recent counts, the global population of the crested ibis, combining wild and captive individuals across all 3 countries, has surpassed 9,000. 9,000, descended in full from 7. It is worth sitting with what that means genetically. Every one of those 9,000 birds carries some share of the same narrow set of genes that happen to survive in that one valley, which is part of why conservationists still monitor the recovery with caution rather than treating it as finished. A population rebuilt from 7 founders is not the same biologically as one that never collapsed in the first place. The species' known range tells a similar story of expansion. At the moment of its rediscovery, the entire known habitat of the crested ibis covered less than 5 square kilometers around one valley. Today, that figure has grown to well over 16,000 square kilometers, with populations now established in Chinese provinces far beyond Shanxi, alongside the wild populations rebuilt in Japan and South Korea. Yangxian itself, the place where the story began, has built a genuine local identity and economy around the bird. Its branded organic rice sold nationally, its nesting platforms drawing visitors, its school children growing up learning to recognize a species their own grandparents had once been told was already gone for good. Despite all of that progress, the crested ibis still carries an endangered classification internationally, a reminder that a recovery this dramatic doesn't erase decades of vulnerability overnight, even after the population has grown 1,000-fold. Is there another conservation story anywhere with a margin this narrow and this specific? Not a broad shift in policy, not a slow-building trend, but a single ornithologist choosing to check one more valley before finalizing a report that would have declared the species extinct for good. If that valley had been surveyed a season later, or skipped altogether, as it very nearly was, none of what came after would exist to tell. Not the pesticide bans, not the farmer partnerships, not the international gifts of breeding pairs, or the wild chicks hatching decades later in countries that had already given up on ever seeing them again. What makes this recovery worth returning to isn't just the number at the end of it. Plenty of species have been pulled back from small populations before, through captive breeding programs, protected reserves, or sheer regulatory force. What sets this one apart is how much of the outcome depended on people who had no formal stake in conservation at all. Farmers choosing lower yields, villagers tolerating restrictions on land they had farmed a certain way for generations, entire communities agreeing to reshape their daily work around the needs of a bird most of them had never seen, up close before Liu's discovery brought attention to their valley. None of that cooperation was guaranteed, and none of it came free. It was negotiated, subsidized, and sustained across 4 decades and 3 governments by people who mostly never met each other and never expected recognition for it. The recovery of the Crested Ibis is, in the end, as much a story about persuading people as it is about protecting birds. 7 birds could not have done any of this alone. It took a scientist willing to check one more valley, farmers willing to accept lower yields, governments willing to gift breeding pairs to former neighbors, and generations of researchers willing to keep watching nests through binoculars long after most people would have called the project finished. That combination is what turned 7 birds into thousands. 7 birds were all that stood between the species and permanent extinction, and 40 years later, that number has crossed 9,000, spread across 3 countries that once had almost nothing left to protect. None of it happened because of a grand policy. It happened because one ornithologist decided to check one more valley, and because farmers, researchers, and 2 governments kept showing up for decades afterward. Which part of this story surprised you most? Japan's captive program that never once succeeded, or the 7 birds that quietly survived a century in one overlooked valley? Drop your answer in the comments. And subscribe, because next week brings a different species and a recovery that started even later.